AOKIGAHARA. The name alone carried a weight, a chill that had little to do with the Japanese air. They called it Yurei, the Sea of Trees, a place where sorrow was said to take root deep in the volcanic soil. For me, stepping past its threshold felt less like entering a forest and more like crossing into a silent testament to forgotten despair. The whispers of Yurei, the restless spirits said to haunt its shadowed paths, were part of why I'd come. But a fainter, more personal echo had also drawn me here. A murmur from the agency, another frayed thread in the tangled web of my lost memories. This notorious forest, heavy with unspoken tragedies, might hold a crucial clue, or perhaps just another dead end in my relentless search. AOKIGAHARA. The name alone carried a weight, a chill that had little to do with the cool Japanese air nipping at my exposed skin. They called it Yurei, the Sea of Trees, but the world knew it better by its more somber moniker, the Suicide Forest. A place where sorrow was said to take root deep in the volcanic soil, as gnarled and unyielding as the ancient trees themselves. For me, stepping past its informal threshold, a worn path disappearing into the gloom, felt less like entering a forest and more like crossing into a silent, sprawling mausoleum. The whispers of Yurei, the restless spirits said to haunt its shadowed paths, were part of why I'd come. Legends were often just that, stories spun from fear and folklore, but sometimes, buried beneath the superstition, lay a kernel of truth, a distorted echo of something real. And real was what I chased, even if it led me into the heart of the unreal. A fainter, more personal echo had also drawn me here. A fragmented note in my recovered journal, scribbled in a hand I barely recognized as my own, mentioned AOKIGAHARA alongside acoustic anomalies and a series of coordinates that the agency had once deemed significant. The agency, the name was a phantom limb, an ache for a past I couldn't fully grasp, a shadowy organization that had built me, then tried to erase me. The metallic tang of their logo, a cold disc against my chest on its chain, was a constant, unwelcome reminder. The air inside the forest was immediately different. Thick, cloying with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. A faint, almost metallic tang that pricked at my nostrils. Sunlight, already weak from the overcast sky, struggled to penetrate the suffocating canopy, casting the undergrowth in a perpetual twilight. The ground was a treacherous carpet of exposed roots, like the skeletal fingers of some buried giant, and porous volcanic rock that crunched unnervingly under my boots. I pulled out my compass. The needle, usually so reliable, danced erratically, a drunkard's stagger before settling, then twitching again. High iron content in the volcanic rock, I muttered, a familiar litany. My scientific mind, or what remained of it after the agency's tampering, clung to logical explanations. It was a defense mechanism, a shield against the creeping unease that AOKIGAHARA seemed to exude like a miasma. I tucked the compass away. It was useless here. The map I'd meticulously studied, and partially redrawn from various sources, would have to be my primary guide, along with a healthy dose of instinct. Silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a remote wilderness, but a profound, almost oppressive stillness. No birdsong, no chattering of insects, not even the distant hum of civilization, only the whisper of my own movements and the occasional, almost imperceptible sigh of the wind through the dense upper branches. Or was it the wind? Sometimes it sounded more deliberate, like a drawn-out exhalation, just beyond the range of clear hearing. I moved deeper, the path I'd initially followed, dissolving into a confusing network of animal trails and indistinct clearings. The trees pressed in, their trunks dark and moss-streaked, their branches interlocked overhead like a macabre cathedral. It was easy to see how one could become disoriented, how hope could curdle into despair in such a place. My old, unwelcome companion, a touch of claustrophobia, began to stir in the pit of my stomach. I took a slow, measured breath, pushing it down. On a low-hanging branch to my left, a length of faded pink plastic ribbon fluttered. the kind people use to mark their way, a lifeline back to the world. But this one ended abruptly, not torn by weather or time, but sliced cleanly as if by a sharp blade. It led nowhere. My gaze dropped to the ground beneath it. There, half hidden by a clump of ferns, lay a single, mud-caked sneaker. A child's size by the look of it, old and weathered, with moss beginning to creep over the laces. A cold knot tightened in my gut. This wasn't just a place of quiet contemplation. I pulled out my small, leather-bound notebook and a pen, the familiar ritual, a small comfort. Entry, AOKIGAHARA, compass unreliable, suspected magnetic interference. Atmosphere oppressive, unnatural silence, sighting, cut trail marker, single child shoe, deteriorated. My handwriting was steady, a stark contrast to the slight tremor I felt in my hand. As I straightened up, a sound cut through the stillness. A distinct snap, like a dry twig breaking underfoot. Not far off. I froze, every sense instantly on high alert, my hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of the combat knife sheathed at my hip. The forest held its breath, and so did I. Something, or someone, was out there with me, and the silence that followed was more menacing than any sound could have been. The silence that followed the snap was absolute, a void that sucked in sound and amplified the frantic thumping of my own heart. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, knife still gripped tight, scanning the dense, unmoving tapestry of trees and shadows. Nothing. No further sound, no flicker of movement from the gloom, just the unblinking, indifferent stare of the forest. Slowly, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A deer, perhaps. A wild boar. Aokigahara wasn't entirely devoid of wildlife, despite its grim reputation and the unnatural quiet. It was the logical explanation, the one my training and inherent skepticism leaned towards. Yet, the feeling of being observed didn't dissipate with the imagined animal. It clung to me, a cold, invisible shroud prickling the hairs on the back of my neck. I forced myself to move, but my steps were more measured now, my senses stretched taut, cataloging every nuance of this unnerving environment. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch under its own weight, sent a jolt through my system. The path, if it could even be called that, twisted and turned, a disorienting labyrinth designed by nature itself, or perhaps by something else entirely. I began to make small, deliberate marks on certain trees with the edge of my knife, shallow slashes that wouldn't unduly harm them but would, I hoped, serve as breadcrumbs if I needed to retrace my steps. A futile gesture, perhaps, in a forest that seemed to swallow light and direction with equal, voracious ease. The whispers started again, or perhaps they'd never truly stopped, just receded below the threshold of my conscious hearing before. This time, they were closer, more insistent. Not words I could decipher, not yet, but sibilant hisses and soft, breathy murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very air around me, from the moss-covered rocks and the gnarled roots that snaked across the forest floor like petrified veins. I'd read about auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise, especially under conditions of stress or sensory deprivation. It was a plausible, scientific explanation. But plausible didn't make it any less unnerving as the sounds caressed my ears. My claustrophobia, a beast I usually kept well caged, began to rattle its bars. The trees, ancient and towering, seemed to lean in, their branches intertwining like a thorny, suffocating cage. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me, making each breath a conscious effort. I focused on my breathing, on the mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other, fighting the rising tide of panic. The agency had put me through worse, I reminded myself. Confined spaces designed to break lesser men, psychological torments far more direct. But this was different. This wasn't a sterile, controlled environment. This was wild, untamed, and imbued with a palpable, ancient sense of sorrow. I came across another clearing, or rather, a small depression, where the trees thinned slightly, allowing a sliver more of the bruised gray sky to show through. And in the center, a splash of incongruous color stood out against the muted greens and browns, a child's bright yellow raincoat draped over a low, lichen-covered boulder. It was relatively new, not yet ravaged by the elements like the sneaker I'd found earlier, though damp and stained with mud. Beside it, a small, plush rabbit, its fur matted, one button eye missing, lay face down in the dirt. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, sharp and unexpected, an emotion that felt alien yet intimately familiar. This wasn't an ancient relic, a footnote in the forest's long history of despair. This felt recent. I knelt, my gloved fingers brushing the cold, slick fabric of the raincoat. No signs of a struggle, no blood, just abandonment. The image of the single small sneaker flashed in my mind. Were they connected? The thought sent a fresh chill down my spine. My hand went to my notebook, the pen scratching across the page. Second sight. Child's raincoat, plush toy. Condition suggests recent placement. Auditory phenomena. Persistent whispers, non-linguistic. Feeling of being watched intensifying. I paused, pen hovering over the paper. How do you scientifically categorize a feeling? How do you log a palpable sense of despair that you were certain wasn't entirely your own? As I stood, a gust of wind, a genuine, undeniable gust this time, swirled through the small clearing, rustling the leaves overhead with a sudden violence and making the yellow raincoat flap like a trapped, desperate bird. And with that gust, for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, I heard a word, clear as a bell, whispered right beside my ear, a Japanese word, ka-san, mother. I spun around, knife flashing out, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. Nothing. Just the trees, their dark forms unmoving. The oppressive silence returning as quickly as it had been broken. The yellow raincoat settled back onto the rock, a limp splash of color in the monochrome gloom. My skin prickled. My mind raced, trying to process it, to file it away under hallucination or trick of the wind. But it had been too clear, too distinct. The skepticism I'd worn like armor for so long, the logical framework I relied upon to navigate a world teeming with the inexplicable, was beginning to crack. And a chilling thought took root, a seed of dread in the fertile ground of my uncertainty. What if the acoustic anomalies the agency had been so interested in weren't just sound waves but something far more personal? What if this forest didn't just hold echoes of sorrow but actively called out with them? The whispered word, ka-san, hung in the air long after the sound itself had faded, an invisible brand seared into my consciousness. Mother. It wasn't a threat, not an accusation, but something far more unsettling. A plea imbued with an unutterable sadness. I stood there for a long moment, the knife still in my hand, my breath misting in the cool, damp air. My initial surge of adrenaline slowly ebbed, replaced by a profound disquiet. This forest wasn't just playing tricks on my senses. It felt like it was actively trying to communicate, to burrow into my mind. Shaking off the lingering chill, I forced myself to lower the knife, though I didn't sheath it. The forest's oppressive silence had returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. I took one last look at the yellow raincoat and the forlorn rabbit, a fresh wave of that vicarious sorrow washing over me. Whatever tragedy had unfolded here, it was a heavy burden for this place to bear. I pressed on, the memory of that single, clear word, a disturbing counterpoint to the rustle of my own movements. The landscape grew increasingly disorienting. The subtle markers I'd been leaving seemed to vanish as soon as I turned my back. Or perhaps the trees themselves were shifting, their gnarled forms rearranging into new, unfamiliar patterns. My carefully studied map, which had seemed so clear and logical back in the relative sanity of my temporary lodgings, now felt like a child's crude drawing, bearing little resemblance to the bewildering reality around me. Paths that should have been there weren't, and new, equally unpromising trails appeared where none were indicated. The feeling of being lost, a primal fear I hadn't experienced so acutely since my early, disoriented days after the agency's betrayal, began to tighten its icy grip. I stopped, pulling out the map again, trying to reconcile it with my surroundings. The coordinates I was aiming for, the ones from my fragmented journal, should have been within a kilometer or two of my current estimated position. But in Aokigahara, a kilometer could feel like 100. The dense canopy blotted out any reliable view of the sun, and the forest floor offered few distinguishing landmarks, each patch of moss-covered rock and tangled undergrowth looking disturbingly similar to the last. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my composure. I fought it down, focusing on the tactical breathing exercises the agency had drilled into us. 4 counts in, hold for 4. 4 counts out. It helped, a little. But the whispers persisted, slithering at the edges of my hearing, sometimes sounding like soft, mournful sighs, other times like indistinct, urgent murmurs. And then, there were the shadows. In the deep gloom between the tree trunks, in the periphery of my vision, I kept catching fleeting glimpses of movement. Dark shapes, no bigger than a large animal, or perhaps a stooped human figure, flitting from one shadow to the next. Whenever I turned my head for a direct look, they were gone, leaving only the unmoving trees and the unsettling feeling that I was not alone. Were they Yurei? Figments of a stressed and sleep-deprived imagination? Or something else entirely? Something the agency hadn't prepared me for? My skepticism was taking a serious beating. Frustration began to gnaw at me. I was a trained operative, a survivor. I'd navigated hostile urban environments, infiltrated secure facilities, and faced down creatures that defied natural law. But this forest, with its silent, psychological warfare, was a different kind of enemy. It didn't attack directly. It disoriented, it unnerved. It chipped away at your sanity, one whispered word, one fleeting shadow at a time. I found myself circling back to a distinctively twisted pine tree, one I was certain I'd passed at least half an hour ago. The shallow slash I'd made in its bark was a mocking confirmation. I was walking in circles, a classic sign of disorientation. The forest was playing with me, a cat with a cornered mouse. A wave of intense loneliness, sharp and sudden, washed over me. It wasn't just the physical isolation. It was the crushing weight of my lost past, the absence of any true connection in my current existence. The faces of Sarah Chen, her intelligent eyes full of a concern I hadn't appreciated at the time, and Marcus Thorne, his expression a mask of cold, calculating ambition, flickered through my mind. Were they ghosts too, in their own way haunting the periphery of my broken memory? The Zippo in my pocket felt heavy, a comforting weight. The name etched on its worn casing, Eleanor, was a mystery, another piece of the puzzle of who I once was. Sometimes, I'd flick it open just to feel the familiar click, to see the flame bloom, a small, defiant spark against the encroaching darkness. As dusk began to bleed into the already dim light, turning the shadows from gray to an inky black, a new, more urgent fear took hold. Spending a night in Aokigahara, exposed and disoriented, was not a prospect I relished. The forest seemed to come alive in a different way after dark, the whispers growing bolder, the shadows deeper and more menacing. I needed to find a defensible spot, some semblance of shelter, before the last vestiges of daylight were swallowed completely. But in this bewitching, ever-shifting maze, even that simple goal felt like a monumental task. The forest had me in its grasp, and I wasn't sure it intended to let go. The encroaching darkness lent a new urgency to my movements. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, sounded amplified in the fading light, potentially heralding something more than just the forest settling for the night. My meticulously planned provisions included a high-powered flashlight, but I was reluctant to use it yet, not wanting to advertise my presence more than necessary to whatever unseen watchers shared this desolate space. For now, I relied on the residual twilight and my own straining senses. It was during this desperate search for a semi-defensible spot to wait out the night that I stumbled, quite literally, over it. My boot caught on something metallic and unyielding, hidden beneath a thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss. I pitched forward, catching myself with outstretched hands, my palms stinging as they scraped against the rough volcanic rock. Cursing under my breath, more in frustration than pain, I pushed myself up and turned to see what had tripped me. Brushing away the debris, my gloved fingers closed around something cold, angular, and undeniably man-made. As I cleared more of the leaves, a dark rectangular shape emerged. It was a metal case, roughly the size of a small briefcase, its surface pitted and corroded but still intact. It looked military-grade, or at least designed for extreme durability. And there, emblazoned on its grimy surface, almost obscured by dirt and time, was a symbol that made the blood freeze in my veins, the stark, geometric logo of the agency. My breath hitched. The agency. Here, deep within the cursed embrace of Aokigahara. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden profound silence that seemed to fall around me, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. For a moment, I could only stare, the implications cervello, brain, Italian, but Alex might have picked up some agency jargon, through my mind in a dizzying torrent. This wasn't just some random piece of lost equipment. This was evidence. Concrete, tangible proof that the agency had been active in this godforsaken place, for reasons I couldn't yet fathom. With trembling fingers, I worked at the latches. They were stiff, almost seized with rust. But after a moment of concerted effort, one gave way with a protesting shriek of metal, then the other. I hesitated, a sudden apprehension gripping me. What secrets lay within? What horrors had the agency been involved with here, in a place already synonymous with despair? Taking a deep breath, I lifted the lid. The interior was padded with dense, custom-cut foam, now slightly mildewed, and nestled within the indentations were several items. The first was a device I recognized instantly, a specialized sensor array, similar to ones I'd used on past assignments. This one, however, seemed more advanced, more compact, with a series of delicate, hair-like filaments extending from one end. It was designed to detect and analyze subtle energy signatures, bioelectric fields, psychic imprints, the very things that legends of Yurei might be a distorted interpretation of. Beside it lay a data slate, its screen dark and lifeless. I pressed the power stud, but nothing happened. The battery was long dead, or the device itself was fried. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, lanced through me. If there were records, mission logs, anything to explain the agency's presence, they were locked within that inert piece of technology. There was one more item, tucked into a smaller compartment. A standard-issue agency tranquilizer pistol, but of an older model I hadn't seen in years. 3 darts were still clipped to its side, their tips a dull, ominous silver. Why would they need tranquilizers here? Were they studying the local fauna? Or were they expecting to encounter something or someone they didn't want to kill, only subdue? I carefully lifted the sensor array. It was cold to the touch, inert. I turned it over in my hands, 1,000 questions swirling. Had they been successful? Had they found what they were looking for? And what exactly was that? The fragmented note in my journal, acoustic anomalies, suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. Were they trying to record the whispers of the forest? To capture the very essence of its sorrow? The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The agency hadn't just been interested in Aokigahara from a distance. They had been here, on the ground, conducting experiments. The coordinates in my journal, the ones I'd been so desperately trying to reach, probably led to a primary research site, perhaps even a temporary field lab. This case was likely lost, or deliberately abandoned. This changed everything. My quest was no longer just about exploring a haunted forest or chasing vague superstitions. It was about uncovering a specific, clandestine operation by the very organization that had stolen my life. The forest's oppressive atmosphere, the whispers, the fleeting shadows, were they all natural phenomena amplified by the setting's grim reputation, or had the agency's meddling somehow enhanced them? Stirred something up that was best left undisturbed? The metallic disc of my own agency necklace felt suddenly colder against my skin. Had I been part of this? Had these woods once echoed with my own footsteps, carrying out orders I no longer remembered? The thought was a chilling one. I carefully repacked the case, its contents, a heavy weight of new questions and dawning dreadful possibilities. The darkness was almost complete now. The forest, a realm of impenetrable shadows. But the discovery of the case had ignited a new, albeit grim, determination within me. I wasn't just lost in Aokigahara anymore. I was on a trail, a cold, dark trail that led directly back to the heart of my stolen past. And I would follow it, no matter where it led, or what horrors it might reveal. The last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky, surrendering the forest to an impenetrable, inky blackness. With the discovery of the agency's case, the nature of my predicament had shifted, but the immediate, primal need for survival remained. The temperature plummeted, a damp, bone-chilling cold seeping through my layers of clothing. The wind, which had been an intermittent sigh, now seemed to whisper with a more distinct, almost conversational malevolence through the unseen canopy. Reluctantly, I unclipped the high-powered flashlight from my belt. The sudden beam cut a stark white tunnel through the oppressive darkness, making the surrounding shadows leap and dance like grotesque puppets. It offered a small circle of clarity, but also made me feel intensely exposed, a solitary beacon in an ocean of unseen watchers. Every leaf, every gnarled branch caught in its beam seemed to take on a distorted, almost monstrous form. Finding a defensible position was paramount. I eventually settled for a shallow depression at the base of a particularly massive, ancient cedar, its trunk too thick to easily scale and its lower branches offering a semblance of overhead cover. It wasn't ideal. There was no true shelter from the elements or a determined pursuer, but it was the best I could find in the encroaching gloom. I placed the agency's case beside me, a cold metallic reassurance and a heavy burden all at once. My claustrophobia, which had been a low hum of anxiety throughout the day, now ratcheted up several notches. The darkness felt tangible, pressing in on me from all sides, the unseen trees forming a suffocating, invisible cage. The flashlight beam, while necessary, also seemed to shrink my world, confining me to its small, illuminated circle while the vast, unseen horrors of the night pressed in just beyond its reach. I forced myself to go through the motions of setting up a minimal camp. I couldn't risk a fire. The smoke would be a beacon, and the light, while comforting, would destroy my night vision and attract unwanted attention, whether from the forest's spectral inhabitants or something more tangible. I ate a tasteless protein bar, the act of chewing and swallowing mechanical, my senses still straining against the darkness. Water from my canteen tasted metallic, tinged with the forest's inherent gloom. That's when the night truly began to work on me. The whispers, which had been intermittent and indistinct during the day, now became a constant, insidious chorus. They swirled around me, seeming to emanate from the very trees, from the ground beneath, even from the air itself. Sometimes they were soft and mournful, like the weeping of countless lost souls. Other times they were sharp and accusatory, though the words remained frustratingly just beyond comprehension, like a radio tuned slightly off station. My scientific mind tried to dismiss them as the wind, as the settling of the forest, as my own overstressed auditory nerves. But the sheer persistence, the almost conversational cadence, gnawed at my resolve. Shadows writhed at the edge of my flashlight beam. I'd catch a flicker of movement, a dark shape detaching itself from the deeper blackness, only for it to melt away when I swung the light towards it. Were they real? Were they the Yurei the locals spoke of, drawn to the light or to the turmoil within me? Or was my mind, deprived of familiar sensory input and saturated with an atmosphere of dread, simply conjuring phantoms from the darkness. The line between reality and illusion was becoming terrifyingly thin. The cold was a relentless enemy, seeping into my bones, making my muscles ache. I shivered, despite my layers. But it was more than just the physical cold. A deeper, more profound chill had settled within me. A dread that had little to do with the temperature. It was the dread of the unknown. The dread of a past I couldn't remember, but which felt menacingly close. And the dread of what this forest and the agency's involvement in it truly represented. My thoughts, unbidden, drifted to the contents of the case. The sensor array. The tranquilizer gun. What had they been hunting? What had they been studying? The image of the child's yellow raincoat, the single sneaker, returned with a fresh pang of unease. Were these isolated tragedies, the sad detritus of individual despair, or were they connected, somehow, to the agency's silent, sinister work? Sleep was an impossibility. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me tensing, my hand reaching for my knife. The Zippo felt warm in my pocket, a small anchor to a reality that seemed to be slipping away. I found myself flicking it open periodically, the brief flare of the flame, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming darkness. The name Eleanor, a momentary, though still opaque, comfort. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each one a fresh assault on my nerves. I thought of Sarah Chen, her calm, logical presence. What would she make of this? Would her science have an answer for the palpable sorrow that saturated Aokigahara, for the whispers that promised madness? And Thorn, I could almost see his thin, cruel smile in the darkness, reveling in the kind of psychological crucible this forest represented. I wasn't just fighting the forest anymore. I was fighting the encroaching darkness within my own mind, the tendrils of fear and paranoia that sought to take root. The agency had tried to break me before. AOKIGAHARA, it seemed, was trying to finish the job. And as the night wore on, under the oppressive gaze of the unseen, I began to wonder if it might succeed. The black heart of the night in AOKIGAHARA was a crucible. The whispers had intensified, no longer just a murmur at the edge of hearing, but a cacophony of sorrowful sighs, indistinct pleas, and occasionally a chillingly clear word or phrase that seemed to pluck at the frayed edges of my sanity. Lost so cold, help me. The voices were myriad, overlapping, a chorus of despair that threatened to drown out my own thoughts. My flashlight beam, which had earlier felt like a small shield, now seemed to attract them. Shadows danced with a new, unsettling boldness just beyond its reach, coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes that would dissipate like smoke when the light fell directly upon them. It was a macabre game of peekaboo, designed to fray the nerves of even the most stoic operative. My training warred with the primal fear coursing through my veins. Tactical awareness. Threat assessment. Maintain composure. The agency's doctrines echoed in my mind, a stark contrast to the spectral chaos unfolding around me. Then, the phantoms of my own past began to emerge, invited, it seemed, by the forest's insidious influence. A shimmer in the air at the edge of my light resolved itself, for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, into the face of Sarah Chen. Her expression wasn't accusatory, but filled with a profound sadness, her gray eyes mirroring the sorrow of the forest itself. "Alex, what have they done to you?" Her voice seemed to whisper, not through the air, but directly into my mind. I reached out, a choked sound escaping my lips, but she dissolved, leaving only the cold, unyielding bark of a cedar tree. The illusion, or whatever it was, left me shaken. Sarah had been a colleague, perhaps even a friend. The lines were blurred in my fractured memory. Her disappearance after my own had always been another unanswered question, another loose end the agency had likely tied up. To see her here, in this place of torment, felt like a cruel mockery. Not long after, Another figure materialized, this one far more menacing. Marcus Thorne. His angular face, usually set in an expression of cold disdain, was twisted into a smirk of pure, unadulterated malice. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence alone was a torment, a reminder of betrayal, of experiments, of a life stolen and reshaped. He seemed to loom over me, his eyes glittering in the reflected light of my flashlight, a silent judgment, a promise of further pain. I lunged, a guttural snarl tearing from my throat, my knife flashing out, but I met only empty air. The image vanished, leaving me panting, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Were these merely stress-induced hallucinations, my subconscious dredging up figures from my fragmented past? Or was Aokigahara itself a psychic amplifier, a place where strong emotions, past traumas, and perhaps even the lingering imprints of the dead could take on a horrifying, semi-tangible form? The sensor array in the agency case suddenly seemed less like a tool for passive observation and more like a device intended to interact with, or perhaps even provoke, these phenomena. The cold deepened, but it was the icy tendrils of fear coiling around my mind that were more debilitating. The agency had subjected me to psychological conditioning, to memory wipes, to extreme duress. But this felt different. This wasn't a controlled experiment. This was a raw, primal assault on the very foundations of my sanity. The forest wasn't just a location, it was an entity feeding on despair, reflecting it, amplifying it. My necklace, the one with the agency's logo, grew unnaturally cold against my skin, almost burning. I clutched at it, a strange compulsion. Did it have some other function I wasn't aware of? Was it a beacon, a tag, or just a cruel reminder of my chains? Pud. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chorus of whispers, sharper, more defined. The sound of weeping, not the generalized sorrow that seemed to permeate the air, but the distinct, heartbreaking sobs of a child. It seemed to come from just beyond the reach of my light, from the impenetrable darkness between the trees. "Mama Doko? Mommy, where?" The voice was small, terrified, achingly real. Every instinct screamed at me to investigate, to help. My own lost past, my ingrained if suppressed compassion, urged me forward. But another part of me, the hardened operative, the survivor, knew it was a lure. The forest was learning, adapting, finding new ways to probe my weaknesses. The image of the yellow raincoat, the single sneaker, flashed through my mind. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice hoarse, trying to project an authority I didn't feel. The weeping intensified, closer now. Samui, kawaii. Cold, scared. I swept the flashlight beam in the direction of the sound. For a split second, I saw it, or thought I saw it. A small, hunched figure, no bigger than a child of 5 or 6. Its form indistinct, almost translucent. Its head bowed as if in unbearable grief. Then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The air around me crackled with an unseen energy. The whispers rose to a frantic crescendo, a storm of disembodied voices swirling around my small, makeshift sanctuary. The trees themselves seemed to groan, their branches creaking like the timbers of a ship in a violent storm, though the wind outside my small clearing seemed no stronger than before. I was no longer just an observer, an investigator. I was a participant in AOKIGAHARA'S sorrowful drama, my own past and the forest's tormented present merging into a terrifying, psychological onslaught. The line between what was real, what was a memory, and what was a manifestation of this accursed place had blurred beyond recognition. And as the first, faint hint of a pre-dawn gray began to seep into the eastern sky, I knew I had to find a way out, not just of the forest, but of the labyrinth of my own fracturing mind.